Hello and welcome to the Bloodstream Podcast, a show serving the greater bleeding disorders community, brought to you by Believe Limited and Bloodstream Media and made possible thanks to our presenting sponsor, Takeda. I am your patient advocate and host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I am your healthcare advocate, nonprofit nerd, and your other host, Amy Board, reminding you to please speak with a healthcare professional before making any treatment decisions.
On today's show, aging with a bleeding disorder. It's complex, it's important, and it's happening. So we're going to talk about it. We've got stories from Jeffrey, Barb, Walter, and Prisilla.
All the things. It's like a band.
We have got a band today. We've got the brand new Beatles. On today's episode, we've got all of that and more today on Bloodstream. Welcome to Bloodstream.
Hey, y'all. We love that you're here. We love that you're here. And if you like what you hear today, please subscribe to the Bloodstream Podcast wherever you listen to those podcasts, all the things.
There's a lot of places you can listen. Subscribe everywhere and leave reviews, too. I also want to remind you, dear listeners, that the Bloodstream Podcast is indeed made possible thanks to our presenting sponsor, Takeda.
Oh?
Yes, that's right. Takeda.
Great.
Takeda has got this website, bleedingdisorders.com, where you can learn all about Takeda's resources for and commitment to the bleeding disorders community. Amy, Takeda believes in a world free of bleeds.
Which is awesome.
And they're dedicated more than ever in their efforts to offer a wide range of programs and support to help patients throughout their treatment journey, wherever on that journey you may be, and you can learn more by simply visiting bleedingdisorders.com. One more time in spoken word, that's bleedingdisorders.com. And for their founding and ongoing support of the Bloodstream Podcast, I would just like to say thanks, Takeda.
Thank you, Takeda.
We're back in studio.
I was just about to say, I was like, does everyone feel like, I don't know, it's just like crackling with possibility that like it might get loose. We're back in studio, baby.
It's a Friday. We're chilling. We've got a dog hanging out with us.
I'm babysitting my friend Seth and Mel's dog, Mr. Scoots.
Mr. Scoots.
And I don't know if he's going to let me pick him up because...
I wouldn't try during the recording.
No, I don't think so. But he is here.
He is here, already serving his role of distracting us from the mission at hand. So 2 minutes in, mission accomplished, Scoots.
100%.
Thank you, Scoots.
Thank you, Mr. Scoots.
We do have, this is a unique episode, Amy. It's like a total story-driven episode on a certain portion of our population, you know, folks who are aging with a bleeding disorder.
Well, I want listeners to know that we weren't smart. It's not like we
weren't smart, listeners.
We didn't like plan this episode and then like try to go get these folks. We realized we had several stories. They're all obviously unique and wonderful, but they had this through line of like aging with hemophilia, these stories. And so we decided with our producer Keith that we would make an episode out of it, and you know we're excited about it. But the thing that really struck me is that when I was working for the chapter, which was eons ago, now like over 7 years ago or something, it was like pulling teeth trying to find the older generation. They just didn't want to necessarily engage with the community, which was absolutely anybody's purview.
Sure.
But it was like pulling teeth to find anybody. And now we have these folks that are so engaged and wanting to share their stories on Bloodstream. And it was really meaningful.
Yeah, for sure. They're coming to us, which is what's really neat. You know, you go from people it's like pulling teeth to get people to meetings to people reaching out saying, hey, I'd like to share my story. Hey, I don't think my portion of the community is getting enough attention. And, you know, that's part of what the Bloodstream Podcast is here to do, receive those kind of moments and say, well, let's get your story. Let's get it out there. Let's amplify it. And to your point, Amy, we found a few stories that had some nice common ground. And so we stitched them together for this Aging with Hemophilia and Bleeding Disorders episode. So let's get into the storytelling. But the very first segment I need to let you know is brought to you by Genentech. There is a new short film out that's dedicated to moms who care for their sons with hemophilia A. It's an honest and visually striking journey about a mother going through the emotional whirlwind of raising a son with hemophilia A. This story is inspired by thousands of real moms and serves as a thank you for all that they do to make the hemophilia A caregiver community a place of love and resilience. Visit www.hemashort.com. That's hemashort.com to watch the short film. And we'll have a link in the program notes. Up first, Jeffrey and Barb. I'm joined today by two voices who have helped shape the bleeding disorders community for a long time. Their stories are layered with hardship, healing, humor, and hope. And today we have the privilege of listening. Jeffrey Moualim and Barb Forss, welcome to Bloodstream.
Thank you.
Now, Jeffrey, you and I first crossed paths years ago during the National AIDS Grove and the creation of the Hemophilia Memorial, but this is actually the first real conversation that we have had. And Barb, I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting until now, so it's truly an honor to welcome you both to Bloodstream and personally to say hello.
Same here.
Now, for those who are meeting you for the first time, can you introduce yourselves a little bit and just share how bleeding disorders have shaped your lives over the years? I know that's a big question, but just take it wherever you'd like. And Barb, we'll start with you, and then we'll kick over to Jeffrey.
Okay, I'll try to be succinct because it is a little bit of a lengthy story. I was born in 1951, which means I just turned 73 last year. And for 47 years, I was hospitalized over 50 times, had 26 major operations, and received hundreds of blood products, everything from fresh frozen plasma, cryoprecipitate, prothrombin complex concentrates, and whole blood. And all along the way, everybody said, well, she can't have hemophilia because she's a female. Finally, at age 47, I was diagnosed, and it wasn't hemophilia, but real close cousin. I have severe factor VII deficiency, which, in looking back at things and what I've learned about factor VII deficiency, is it wasn't really discovered until 5 years after I was born. Therefore, very few providers would be looking for it, let alone know anything about it. I was really fortunate, though. I lived in the metropolitan Chicago area where there were 5 HTCs, hemophilia treatment centers, and I made the rounds. I went to every one of them, and it wasn't until I got to the last one, which was recommended to me by a wonderful male nurse and a social worker at the foundation in Chicago. And I was really disappointed with the 4, I guess you would call it consultations that I had, with not feeling that I was being recognized as a person with a bleeding disorder. I wasn't given any treatment. And at that time, the one and only treatment for factor VII deficiency, which is still pretty much the same, was Novo Nordisk's Novo 7. And it was being utilized by inhibitor patients. And none of the HTCs that I went to felt that I was worthy, I guess, of getting it off label. And then I was very, very, very blessed to be directed down south of Chicago about 3 hours to a lovely hematologist who has since passed away. But before she did, she made sure that she taught me everything I needed to know about being a woman with a bleeding disorder. And the very last patient visit I had with her, she said, when I knew you were coming in last night, I studied extra hard because I wanted to make sure I knew as much as you did, because you've been a good student and you've learned. So that progressed. I then moved 1,500 miles away to the Seattle area. I have wonderful treatment center here. And during the process of being a woman with a bleeding disorder, I realized I wasn't alone. This is before we had computers. And long distance calls were expensive. We didn't have really cell phones. So I wrote letters and I started connecting with women throughout the country through different foundations. And we decided to form a little group, and we were calling ourselves the Women with Bleeding Disorders group. And we were meeting locally in libraries and sometimes on the phone if somebody was brave enough to do a 5 or 6 way call. And one of the places we met in Seattle was a library, and they listed us as the women with breathing disorders. And we're like, no, breathing is not a problem. Women with bleeding disorders. And then
at least we don't think. I don't know. Do we need more tests?
Most of the time, yeah. And then another meeting in a restaurant, they listed us as the women with breathing disorders.
Well,
I said, yeah, that can be a problem, but that's not who we are. So I was trying very difficult. What can we name ourselves? And one of the women I was connecting with in Wisconsin and I had been talking about how much we loved our gardens and we have problems with roses getting aphids. And she said, well, ladybugs are supposed to really help eat the aphids. So I went out and bought 1,000 ladybugs, put them in my garden. The next day, they all flew away. But during the course of reading about ladybugs, I found out that they do something called reflex bleeding from their joints.
Hmm.
It's not blood. It's actually, if you've ever held a little ladybug in your hand and thought maybe she peed on you, that's the reflex bleeding from the leg joint that goes into your hand. And it's actually got a really bad smell for predators. So it's a deterrent.
Hmm.
So when I found that out, I thought, well, let's see, I bleed in my knee joints. Ladybugs bleed out. Ladybugs, that's what we'll call us. I started very novice trying to make it into a 501c3. And I found out I was spending all of my time pounding the pavement looking for funding. I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
able to help the women that I wanted to help. So fortunately, I was able to more or less give it to Comprehensive Health Education Services to run as one of their programs. And they're in the process of doing that, and I help as a consultant. So
Wow,
that's
what a
it.
story. That's a great story, Barb. You did a fantastic job of
Thank you.
fitting a lot into a short period of time. And that ladybug story, I'm so sorry that it only lasted one day in your garden, but what a source of
Yeah.
inspiration.
Thank you.
So, Jeffrey, for you, what's the back of your baseball card when it comes to bleeding disorders? How do you want to tell that
Well,
story?
yeah, it's similar in that you can go on and on and on. So I was born in 1955, and it's a very auspicious year because the Brooklyn Dodgers won their first world championship. So that's a bit of trivia. But anyway, there was no hemophilia on either side of my family. They've gone back generations and they can't find. So when I was diagnosed with it at 6 months, it was a complete shock to my parents because that's something they just never ever imagined. So, the early years are hard because all we had was fresh frozen plasma. And my bone structure is, my bones aren't very big. They're pretty thin. So whenever I bled into a joint, it did quite a bit of damage. And so until factor 8 came along in 66, 67, I was on plasma and my joints took quite a blow from that. Factor 8 became available in a concentrate, changed everything. For the first time, I was able to walk on my own. I was able to take trips with my parents. I call it the Renaissance years because I was able to do things that previously I wasn't able to do. And the Renaissance lasted till about 1980, 81. And that's when AIDS hit the community. And to know that if you were going to take your factor and you could be killing yourself in the process by acquiring AIDS was, I don't think, a fear, except for one other time. I don't think I've ever had a fear as pointed as that. So I decided with my mom used to give me the factor. We decided that unless I really needed the factor, that I was going to not take any factor. And for 2 years, I didn't take factor. It spared me from HIV/AIDS, which was the good news. The bad news was my joints, which were bad already, got even worse. So I ended up in a wheelchair. So, if you flip a coin, wheelchair or not being on the planet, I'll take the wheelchair. By the late 80s, I met a lady who turned out to be my wife. We married in 1990. And I was really fatigued with the hemophilia community at that point. I didn't want to be associated with the hemophilia community. I wanted to be thought of as me and not Jeffrey has hemophilia, and that's kind of what we go on right from the beginning. So all during the 1990s and into 2000, I was working in my family's company. My wife and I were taking trips, not thinking anything about hemophilia other than treating it, when I had to. And then 2005 came along and my whole world changed. And what I mean by that is in February of 2005, I got very, very sick one day. And by the nightfall, I was in the emergency at Santa Barbara Cottage. I had varices. And what varices are is when your liver stops functioning the way it should. the veins in your esophagus become engorged with blood. And when they become too engorged, the blood has to go one way or the other. I was throwing up blood. And the hepatologist who was treating me there said, well, you know your liver's failing, right? And I said, no. He said, do you have hepatitis C? I said, yeah, some doctor told me 20 years ago I had hepatitis C. He said, well, that's probably the reason why your liver's failing right now. You have hep C, and you probably got it from, factor 8 product. So for about 7 or 8 months, I had several episodes of the variceal bleeding. And then finally, they said, you have to make a decision. You either have to go on interferon and ribavirin to treat the hepatitis C or get a liver transplant. So being that I had hemophilia, thinking surgery would be my end, I said, no, let's just treat it with the interferon and the ribavirin. And that killed the hepatitis C, but it also killed my liver. So in December of 2005, I went into a coma, and they rushed me to the hospital at Cottage in Santa Barbara, because we lived near Santa Barbara. And the doctor told my wife, the only chance he has is to put him on a ventilator and take him to UCLA in Los Angeles. And so that's what they did. Now, everything in this part of the story is what's been told to me, because I was in a coma, so I didn't experience it consciously.
Sure.
So with transplants, especially liver transplants, if you're not on the list, your only salvation is to get worse, not get better, get worse. The worse you get, the higher you move up on the list. And by Christmas Eve, the doctor had told my wife that I probably only had a couple of days left. And then the first miracle happened. On Christmas night day, a liver became available. And initially, I was supposed to share the liver with somebody else. And they were going to do the surgery the day after Christmas.
I have to ask, how do you share a liver with somebody else?
Well, it's not like sharing a meal. There's some way they divide it. And I don't know the technical way of how they divide it, but they take the whole liver that's been donated by whoever, and I never found out who did donate the liver, and somehow they divide it so it's going to fit into, your body and the other person's body.
Wow. Unbelievable. Sorry to interrupt your flow. I've never heard of that, and that's extraordinary to me.
But the miracle is that when December 26th came around and they started prepping myself and the other person for surgery, the other person developed a fever, and they felt it wasn't safe for him to go into surgery. So I got the whole liver. Now that's a big deal, because if you only get half the liver, you have to hope that the liver regenerates over time. And it's a much more difficult way of recovering from it and living as long as I've ended up living. But I ended up getting the whole liver. So 2 weeks after the liver transplant, I woke up from the coma. So I'd been in a coma for 5 weeks. I felt like I'd been in outer space. I didn't know anything what was going on. They kept having to ask me, who's the president of the United States? And I had to keep repeating it was George W. Bush. That was sometimes more painful than all the other treatment. But I digress. So anyway, 5 weeks in a coma is a long time for your muscles. And so all my muscles had atrophied. I couldn't even sit up in bed for 2 months without help. Mm-hmm. And when I finally was released and went home, I was in a hospital bed for another 3 or 4 months before I was able to even get into a normal kind of bed. So I lost muscle. I lost the sight in my right eye. Basically, I can see a little bit, but not very much. So everybody would come to you and say, God, you're lucky. You got a liver and you survived. And that first year, I thought I was anything but lucky, because I couldn't do as much as I used to do. I didn't feel right. You have to take a lot of anti-rejection drugs in the beginning. That can depress you, which it did. It certainly depressed me. And so I did not feel lucky. I felt very unlucky. And that
Yeah.
was all of 2006, 2007 came along. And one day I just started crying and I couldn't stop. And my wife took me to a psychiatrist. He prescribed a medication for me. It didn't turn out to be that medication that worked, but we worked with it. And finally, by June of 2007, the depression began to lift. And as it began to lift, I could see more of it being, life being half full than half empty. And so my normal, when I'm in my good space, is to be active more mentally than physically. And towards the end of 2007, a friend of mine who I'd known since I was a child named Corey Dubin, he lived about half an hour from where I lived. And I called him one day and I said, "Hey, how's it going?" He said, "Oh, I heard you got a liver transplant." I said, "Yeah." He said, "How are you?" I said, "Good, I'm good." He said, "Well, why don't we get together? We haven't gotten together in 40 years. And I said, "Okay, well, I don't drive." He said, "No, I drive. That's fine." So he drove up to my house, and Corey was, to me, he's an icon of the hemophilia community. He fought so hard for, when AIDS was such an issue, and, he fought for blood safety. I mean, he's one of these people who just gave everything, towards this mission that he gave to himself. So we're talking, and he said, "Well, would you like to join the board of the Committee of 10,000? And I said, "Well, I just don't want to sit on a board for, what can I do?" He said, "Well, do you do books?" I said, "Yeah, I'm a treasurer. I can do books." So by the end of 2007, I became the treasurer of the Committee of 10,000. But that morphed into many more things. And without going into too many of those things, one of those things was advocacy. And what I found out was in myself was that all that time I was running away from the hemophilia community, actually what my real passion is to advocate for people in the hemophilia community. And so from 2007 to today, I've done a lot of advocacy work in different veins. One of the things that we wanted to accomplish at the Committee of 10,000 was to develop a hemophilia memorial, which in 2015, I'm headstrong. I said, "I'm just going to go up to the National AIDS Grove and just ask the director if we can put up a memorial for hemophilia in the National AIDS Grove." So I just called him up out of the blue and I said, "I'm coming to San Francisco. Can we have dinner?" Whatever. He was very nice about it. And within 2 years, we had the memorial. We got the NHF at that time and HFA to contribute money to it. And by 2017, that was the first memorial for people with hemophilia who passed away from either AIDS or hepatitis C. And that's where I bumped into you, obviously. Right now, after going through COVID years, and my wife and I lost our jewelry business because of COVID, we had to resettle. So resettled in Tehachapi, California, because her job is in Nevada, so it's not too far. She commutes there every other week. Should I go into how I met Barb, or should we leave that for another question?
Well, so let me say that was extremely interesting and helpful, and I appreciate both of you sharing your history and the progression. And I wanted you to do that because, Jeffrey, when you contacted me, you had an interest in not just you and Barb sharing, but other voices, other stories getting shared as well. And I said, well, let's do that, but let's first introduce the audience to the two of you. But now let's talk about your vision. What is it that you and Barb have been talking about? What is your vision for community stories that you don't feel are either getting told or getting enough attention?
I'll let Barb start.
Thank you. I think it's pretty common knowledge that the women with bleeding disorders is a very marginalized, underserved group in our country. There's a lot of verbiage about Year of the Woman from all of the national and international organizations and even some of the chapters. And yet, I personally know multitudes of women who, yes, they've had a diagnosis. They're not given any treatment. And especially the mothers and daughters of hemophiliacs, factor 8 and factor 9, who, if they were born with another piece of anatomy, they would be called hemophiliacs. Some of these women have 10, 11% of clotting factor, and they would be called mild hemophiliacs in any other place if they were born male. So it's a definite roadblock. It's a big roadblock. And when Jeffrey and I met on Hemophilia Federation of America call, we actually, it's hard for us to believe we've never met in person. But it was one of those instant connections where we were able to flow with our discussions and both had very, very similar stories, a lot of different ones, but that's the thing that I think we want to emphasize, the need for women and men with bleeding disorders to work together, because you get so much more done when you have both groups working together. I think there has been some history of some feelings that the males in the bleeding disorders community felt that it would be competition if we would come in and be getting sponsored or supported financially by organizations that they were trying to get sponsored by. But I think a lot of that attitude has changed. And when we work together and find so many similarities, we'll have, what do they say, power in numbers in speaking to advocate for ourselves and others.
Well said. Jeffrey, what would you like to add to that?
So just going back in history for a second, when I was at the Committee of 10,000, one of the things that we did towards the end of my time there is we had a national call for women with bleeding disorders. And I have to admit, prior to those calls, I was very ignorant about just how much women suffer with hemophilia, other bleeding disorders. And so that night when we were on the call with Hemophilia Federation, at one point they said, we're going to, do breakout rooms, right? So you can go with the men or you can go with the women. Well, I'm a ladies' man. So I said, put me in one of the women ones. And that's how I met Barb. I mean, you talk about kismet. I mean, if I had said men, I never would have met Barb. I mean, that's exactly how it happened. So I don't know, about 3 months, give or take, after that, we started talking about doing a podcast. And, when we talked about women with bleeding disorders, I knew from my days at the Committee of 10,000 that community was really underserved. I heard stories on calls that, just were heartbreaking. And we've been tossing this podcast idea to serve the community, of course, with women, but also with men, of course. And now with all the cuts that have happened since the Trump administration took power, I thought that was, a logical, subject to also talk about as well.
Well, so we're hopeful to have a recurring spot for the two of you in conversation with various community members as we go forward. And that's why I wanted the audience today to meet Barb and Jeffrey. Hopefully you'll be hearing more from them as we go along with other voices from the community. We've got about 2 minutes remaining. I want to give you each an opportunity to speak to a certain segment of our audience. We have people listening of all ages, mostly in the US, but people from around the world. In particular, though, I want to think about younger folks and the caregivers of children today. And you just spoke, Jeffrey, about the kismet of meeting Barb at a community event, albeit an online community event. That's still a community event. And I think one thing, you also spoke about Corey and growing up together, I think meeting at camp or community events and not seeing each other for 40 years. But we all know how important those relationships formed at camp and events like that are for kids. Is there any message that you'd like to send to the younger generation about the importance of community involvement, not just for the education and the information sharing, but for the relationships that get built and are there throughout your life? Can you speak to that, Jeffrey, and then Barb?
The community has gone through this watershed moment of when AIDS and hepatitis C became a deadly thing. My generation went through it. We lost a lot of people, obviously. And then when that kind of moved over, because we've more or less fixed it with not using blood factor made from blood product, but factor made synthetically. There was kind of a chasm between the younger and older generation, and I think it's stayed that way to some extent even today. And what I mean by that is the older generation, whatever's left in my age group and maybe a little bit younger than me, usually doesn't have much of a relationship with the younger people, say in their 20s and 30s. And that's unfortunate because we can teach them things that they need to know about blood safety. I know that's education and I think there could be a lot more camaraderie between the younger and the older. If the older were able to accept how the younger people live today and vice versa. And when I talk to young people, what I try not to do is say, well, you have it lucky. You have factor 8 now and it's perfect and you're on prophylactic and you don't have, I try to stay away from all of that. I try to see through their eyes what they face today. And if I can help mentor them or advocate for them, that's what I try to do.
That's great, Jeffrey. Thank you for that. And Barb, what would you say is your message?
Being a big believer in paying it forward is what I'm about. I am one of the maybe upper 1% of the women that I know that has everything I need. I have a diagnosis, I have a treatment, I have wonderful providers. Again, not many have that. So it's actually very self-centered for me to be a community advocate because I get back as much as I give. So it builds me up. Being with other women and men with bleeding disorders and encouraging especially the younger ones to become involved, it's a family. Real quickly, I've been to many conferences, especially the very unique ones that are run by Comprehensive Health Education Services, One Drop, which includes people with ultra rare bleeding disorders, and it's a conference just for them. And I've seen males and females for the first time, attendees burst into tears because they finally are with people that get it. And unless they've had that experience and joined in community activities involvement, they might be isolated and feel alone. And you're not alone. There's a lot of people out here that are able to share with you. A real quick story of the first time I became aware that there were a lot of other women is a woman named Renee Paper, who's since passed away, had type 3B, I believe, von Willebrand, and it plagued her whole life. It plagued her so much, she was a registered nurse and started the foundation in Nevada. I heard Renee speak at a conference, my first national NBDF conference in 1997, and I started crying, and afterwards I went up to her and did the whole blah, blah, blah. I was born with factor 7 deficiency, didn't know it, went through this, that. Oh, and after her letting me go on, she finally said, okay, I get it. You're just like us. What are you going to do about it? I hadn't even thought about that. What am I going to do about it? So that was the inspiration for me for getting involved. And I think that young people, if they see that it's helpful to them and helpful to others, it's a good thing. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that kind of modeling, it certainly is. Well, Barb, Jeffrey, I appreciate you both. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to having you back along with other guests whose voices we can bring forward here on Bloodstream. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Jeff and Barb, and you should be hearing their voices here on the Bloodstream podcast again in the future as they're looking to bring through more members of the older generation of people affected by bleeding disorders to hear from here on Bloodstream. But speaking of folks who belong to that cohort, Prisilla Oren is a pretty outspoken and highly engaged member of the community, particularly the online community. And she sat down with me for about 15, 20 minutes a few weeks ago to share a bit of her journey and her current experience as a woman living with hemophilia. Let's take a listen. All right, joining me now is Prisilla Oren, community member. Hi, Prisilla. Welcome to Bloodstream. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you what led to you reaching out to want to come on the podcast. But before answering that, can you just share with listeners a little bit about your background in the community?
Well, it's extensive. I'm old. And I am one of the women who is not just a carrier, but also a hemophiliac with mild factor VIII, but like many women my age, we were never diagnosed until later in life. And now at age 76, I am suffering immensely from the damage that was done during my growth and whatever with joints. And I just had an MRI with a big tear in my hip joint, and I do use hemophilia factor when necessary. But women have not been recognized, and I've been forced to get them recognized because I'm one of the older ones who's been through this. So my point is, I don't want younger women to have to go through the things that I went through because it's not necessary. And I think young women are getting tested now and treated. And I almost died 3 times from hemophilia.
How so?
Tonsillectomy at age 5. They couldn't stop the bleeding. And ironically, on the records I got later, I retrieved them, and it said, "We know there's hemophilia in this family, but this can't be the reason for this because she's a woman." Well, it was. And it ended up, my mother told me I had over a dozen whole blood transfusions. And I actually tested positive for hepatitis at age 5. It was a woman intern who saved me by using silver nitrate to go up to the area that was bleeding and cauterize it. But the thought of hemophilia was never, in fact, they said she must have a vitamin K deficiency. And I know there's other women who went through that same story. And men, mild men, who had those episodes and weren't treated. They didn't know.
Sure, of course. So, Prisilla, how do we stop other women from having the same experience that you had?
What we're doing now, education. And it's a hard thing to do because my own treatment center that my son and nephews have used for many years, I'm the only woman. And it changed hematologists, and the hematologist now at that center said to me when he met me, "I have never treated any women, so I don't know what to do with you. You'll have to tell me what to do with you." And for those of you who know hemophilia, you don't know. You don't know if you're bleeding or not. And many times I was bleeding now that I look back on it. In fact, growing up, I had terrible pain in my knees, and they called it growing pains. And of course it wasn't. It was real bleeds. So now, I recently asked a hematologist if there were any other women in my age group that I could talk to. And he said, unfortunately, not that I know of, and they might not have survived. And I went through childbirth and hemorrhaged and was not treated. And I am still alive, but I'm in a lot of pain. And we can't take much in painkillers.
Right. Prisilla, are you angry?
I'm more angry about the contamination of the blood supply because that affected everyone in our lives, not just the victim, but the family. And right now my daughter is dying from breast cancer at age 55 because she would not take traditional medical care because of what happened to her brother.
Wow.
We never looked at the siblings. And she said to me, "Mom, when you were transfusing my son and you and Dad were so upset because we started infusing him in about age 3, she said, you were crying, Dad was upset. Did you guys ever look in the corner at me and ask how I was doing?" And no, we didn't. And now that she's dying, it breaks my heart because I can't be with her even now.
Why is that?
She lives in Maine and I live in Pennsylvania, and I'm disabled and I can't fly. I can't walk. I can't get there.
Well, I'll say if I was in the kind of pain that you're describing and disabled and unable to be with my daughter during such a time, I think I would feel angry.
Yes, I'm angry at the whole situation of hemophilia. I'm angry about hemophilia, period. Hemophilia makes me angry. My cousin, who was a severe factor VIII, he died at age 32, but he hated his mother. and he hated our grandmother.
Oh, wow.
Because of the hemophilia gene.
Right.
And my son has never brought that up, thank God. My daughter did not have any children because of being a carrier herself. And the dynamics of hemophilia are such that unless you live it, you can't explain it. And it touches every part of your life and your heart and everything. And it's a constant fight, a battle to keep maintained, to get appropriate treatment. And you well know I'm not the only woman who doesn't get appropriate treatment.
Do you still feel like you don't receive appropriate treatment even today?
Yes, absolutely. At one point last year, I had a fall and went into the ER, and they infused me on a Friday night, and I don't know if they really looked at my factor level, but 6 months later, I developed blood clots in my lungs.
Oh, scary.
It was very scary, and I had to go on Eliquis, and I had to go on drip heparin, and I have photos of what my hands look like. It was terrible. And now they don't want to infuse me unless it's absolutely necessary.
So, Priscilla, before we started recording, we were talking about Prisilla, your cat. And as I'm listening to you describe the hardships of life with hemophilia in your circumstance, I'm wondering, what do you do to help keep yourself sane? What do you do for self-care?
Well, my husband and I were both professionals, and I had a degree in elementary ed so I could be with my son when he started school. And I was teaching first grade right across the hall from him, so I could infuse him when necessary. And then I got my master's degree in special education, so I knew all the rules and rights of a person with a disability. I never really had to use that for him because he was gifted, and that was the only special ed he got, was being gifted. He would not go to school if he was bleeding because he didn't want to be seen with crutches or a wheelchair.
Yeah.
In the early years, I carried him on my back when we were in elementary school, but as he grew, not wanting to be seen in a wheelchair made him miss a lot of school. But he has a master's degree from Johns Hopkins, so I guess he didn't miss too much school.
Yeah, school worked out. Sounds like school worked out.
Mm-hmm. And I'll bring this up. My relationship with Barry Hardy was very touching and emotional. Barry was my go-to person. I don't talk to my son about hemophilia or HIV. I would talk to Barry.
Right.
And I could talk openly and honestly with him. And the loss of him hit me very heavy and hard. But, what he did woke up our community to recognize the mental health of our community.
Yes, for sure. For sure. His loss had a tremendous impact. His life had a tremendous impact, and then his loss had a tremendous impact. And you are active online. You see and hear what people are posting about and experiencing and sharing about online. I'm curious to know, we've talked about women with hemophilia, and we know that's an area that is in need of more attention. What other areas do you notice people talking about online that maybe don't get as much attention as you think deserved?
Well, Patrick, we're looking at the world through different eyes right now. We're looking at the future care of hemophilia, and most of us are quite alarmed and afraid of what the future is going to be for the care of hemophilia. The factor, will they be able to get it? For those AIDS survivors, will they be able to get their drugs? So and right now, that's a lot of the talk online, is the fear of what is going to happen.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Prisilla, before I let you go, I want to know if you had one overarching message to share with people in the community from the standpoint of an advocate, as someone who, like you said, got an education and a special education degree to make sure you could care for your son. For other advocates out there, what is your overarching message?
You can't be quiet. You have to talk about it, whether you want to or not, because if you don't speak out, you won't be heard. And I was present at the original Washington days, when we had to listen to the testimony of what happened and why it happened and how it didn't have to happen. And it was crushing. If we hadn't been there, if we hadn't gotten together and gone to Washington, nothing would have ever been done.
Sure.
So even though we wanted to hide hemophilia most of the time, we couldn't. And a lot of people with hemophilia probably don't want other people to know they even have hemophilia. I think that's a social change that needs to be made, and I don't know how it's going to be made. Maybe the younger people aren't afraid to say it or tell people. Obviously, you're not. And you have daughters, don't you?
I have a daughter.
You have a daughter. So you're going to have to speak out on her behalf.
That is true. That is true. It's not just affecting me anymore. I'm now in the caregiver role as well. So I like that message, Prisilla. Don't stay silent. And I appreciate you coming on today and spending a little time with me here on Bloodstream.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for being able to say, help people, help other hemophiliacs who are afraid to talk. And our community kind of fell apart, at least the one with the AIDS issue. We don't have that support anymore. I was a member of the original group. We don't have much support.
Well, I'm glad we could be here for whatever that's worth.
Well, it is. And I know you. I know what you do. I know this is very important. And I'm glad you asked me to be a part of it. Please tell other hemophiliacs to share what they need to share, because it's a lonely world without that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Prisilla. Appreciate you.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick.
Oh, PJL, thank you for that sweet interview with Prisilla.
You're welcome.
I think it's just lovely when people, I think, take the onus to really want to share. Yeah. And I think our younger community, and I think a lot of our caretakers who have children with hemophilia or von Willebrand's or other bleeding disorders very much really relish hearing the stories of that community that has gone before us. So anyway, it was just a really sweet interview.
Appreciate that. What are we hearing from next?
We are going to hear from Walter J., who sat down with our Bloodstream contributor, Hanna.
Hanna, real-time check-in. Happy birthday, Hanna.
It's Hannah's birthday, and Hannah's one of my favorite people ever. Hanna was, she worked at the Iowa Bleeding Disorders Association for a long time, and then she worked at the Colorado chapter for the National Hemophilia Foundation for a long time. I forget about
that Iowa piece. Mm-hmm. I jumped right to the Colorado, but that's right.
I think Colorado stole her from Iowa. She wanted to move to Colorado, so it was kind of like a thing. But gotcha. And then she came over here. So she's her family is affected by hemophilia, so she's very intimately connected. But this was one of the first interviews that she did for us, actually, in her job. So let's take it away, Hanna, with Walter.
Aging with hemophilia wasn't something people talked about because for most of history, it just was something that didn't happen. But today, more people with hemophilia are reaching their 60s, 70s, and even beyond. And it's something to celebrate, to study, and to be proud of. Which brings us here today with Walter Justus. At age 84, he's one of the oldest known people living with hemophilia. But it's not just his age that makes his story remarkable. It's the journey he's taken to get here. Living through decades of hemophilia care and all the changes that comes with it can feel unimaginable until now, where we have made treatment decisions that can change lives. Walter, thank you again for being here with us. Let's go ahead and start at the beginning. Before we get into hemophilia, let's just start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up, the things that you like to do? What was the world like as a kid?
Well, I thought it was pretty wonderful. I was born in 1941 in Racine, Wisconsin. It's a mid-sized town about 70 miles north of Chicago on Lake Michigan. And, of course, when I was born, I had, my parents had no idea I had hemophilia. I had some bleeding episodes that went untreated. And it wasn't until I was a senior in high school. I was 17 years old. It was in the winter, and I had a kidney bleed. Went to our GP, which was the only doctor we knew, And he couldn't figure it out, put me in the hospital. And I was in the hospital for over a week before they called a specialist up from Chicago, a urologist actually. And he did some testing and, at first couldn't figure it out, but he did some more additional blood tests. And he came back and told my parents that I had hemophilia. As a kid, it didn't mean much to me. My parents didn't really question what to do about it. Of course, at the time, there wasn't any treatment, literally none. Sometimes if people had severe hemophilia and they had a bleed in those days, they would receive whole blood. But, your body can only take so much volume, so they could never give enough whole blood to effectively stop a bleed. Fortunately, I didn't have any of those issues. My hemophilia is mild to moderate. So I've had, spontaneous bleeds, injuries, that sort of thing. So I went through childhood and teenage years not paying much attention to my hemophilia, doing all the things that kids do. How I survived, just good luck, I guess. No idea. Kept me out of school a few times. Generally speaking, I had soft tissue bleeds, or intramuscular bleeds, that sort of thing. So they'd be painful, but they wouldn't be particularly dangerous, And I moved to California in 1962, and that was my first contact with a hematologist. I had a bleed there and went to the doctor. They didn't know what to do about it, but they referred me to a hematologist. He stuck me in the hospital, and I got my first treatment of cryo. I think it was, I want to say 64, 65, somewhere in that neighborhood. So, two firsts in California. That was my first treatment and my first hematologist. You had asked me what I like to do and those sort of things. I think part of what got me here is I was active all the time. Avid cyclist, I got my first bike at 6 years old and was always on a bike. As kids, that was our freedom. That was our way to go places, do things without having to have a parent take you in a car. In those days, people only had one car, So I continued it throughout my entire life, up until I had a pretty serious crash and broke my hip. I was 66 when that happened. People had hip replaced, at that age for other reasons, but my hips were in great shape until I fractured one. That was quite a hemophilia experience too. It's pretty major surgery. And I got through it okay, but I think the factor cost more than the surgery did. But I kind of gave up cycling then. The fear of breaking either that hip again or a different one was, something I didn't want to experience. It was probably the most excruciating pain I'd ever experienced. That's a whole other story.
Pain management.
Yeah, exactly. I was a backpacker and a hiker when I was younger. I don't do it anymore. I've got a bad ankle because of hemophilia. And it's funny, that brings up another topic almost, because I didn't typically get joint bleeds, but many years ago, they didn't know much about what they call microbleeds now. Mm-hmm. And I had apparently a lot of microbleeds into my right ankle for some reason. And I don't know if I maybe injured it at some point and it became a target joint or something. I don't know. Nobody's ever been able to tell me why. So that ankle's got arthritis in it. The subtalar joint is bone on bone, and so it's pretty painful. So I'm able to walk about, I do somewhere between 1.5 miles and 2 miles every day. I've got a dog that I walk. She won't let me stay in the house.
That's
amazing.
A good
thing, I guess, Otherwise, I think I'd probably plant myself on my chair and stay there.
Understandably so. Yeah. It sounds like you had quite the eventful childhood and that your hemophilia didn't quite alter your lifestyle of living the way you wanted to as a child.
Well, if I'd known more about it, it probably would have. And, I've thought a lot about that, and, I'll say again that, probably being mild to moderate was a benefit, if you want to call it that. it probably kept me out of some trouble, especially since treatment was basically unavailable. It just, I think back on it now and some of the things that I did and places that I went, and, it just frightens me. But, sometimes it's good what you don't know.
It can be.
But I was active, very active. And I think by some standards, I probably still am. And I think that's probably what benefited me. I was an active swimmer. Some of those things have kind of been couched. Tell you what really put a dent in my activity, other than just age, was COVID.
Oh.
I used to go to the Y pretty regularly, but once COVID hit, that was the last place I wanted to go. Mm-hmm. And I kind of got out of the habit, but now that I didn't have a dog then, though, but now that I have a dog, that that keeps me more active. And I still do some hiking and stuff,
That's great. Still living that active lifestyle, having that one to love with. Walter, you shared a little bit about how when you were growing up, there was really a lack of any access of treatment for hemophilia, so it just wasn't too relevant in your life. Can you share a little bit about how you've seen the advancements in treatments and how that has led into some of your decision-making for your own care?
Oh, sure. Well, like I said earlier, my first treatment for hemophilia was cryoprecipitate in the mid-60s. And that was quite a revelation, that was amazing. But of course it was, you had to go to the hospital for it because it was a lengthy procedure. It would take anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. So it was always just on demand. If you got hurt or had a bleed, you had to call the doctor and meet him at the hospital and get the cryo. And there was a lot of crap in cryo. If somebody had a cold or something or a virus, you got it, and they used to have, be there with Benadryl in case I had an allergic reaction, in case there was something there. So it was not without its faults, obviously, but it was, obviously a whole lot better than nothing. Mm-hmm. And, the concentrated lyophilized powders came out in the 70s, and that again was, everybody thought that was a wonderful advancement. And unfortunately, they were still making that product out of pooled blood sources, and that's when HIV came along. People that, like myself, that were alive in that area, it was basically playing Russian roulette. And I was living here in Idaho when that happened. I moved to Idaho in 75 from California. Okay. And I had a really great hematologist. And when he got information about HIV, he put me back on cryo, took me off the lyophilized powders and put me back on cryo because he was certain that source was safer at the time. And it was, because I dodged that bullet. I did not, come down with HIV. So one of the few of my age that didn't, because it affected about 90% of the population, the hemophilia population. So that was scary times. Well, then they started doing better heat treatments and things. And then it wasn't long after that when they came out with the recombinants. I was pretty excited about the recombinants. I can't say it was guaranteed to be safe, but it was certainly considered to be safe. So the very first ones, they used a hamster ovary, and I took my first dose and I had an allergic reaction to it because it turns out I was allergic to hamsters. Had no idea.
The things you learn, huh?
Yeah. So, yeah. But, they got around that and they started using, other ones. And I use one now that's from a human clone, so that's not a problem at all anymore. But, there's been just so many advancements. It's just, from nothing to, now gene therapy, although I don't have much stock in gene therapy. I mean, I think it's oversold and way underdeveloped. It's got a long ways to go yet. That's just my personal feeling about it. Other people feel differently, and that's fine. But
absolutely,
I wouldn't consider it.
Yeah,
but it's amazing the the string of development.
And there's always more to like continue to research and look into it. And we can only grow from here as we've learned with all of the advancements.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm curious, Walter, when you look back now, do you ever think about how different things could have been if you and your hematologist did not make that decision to go back to Cairo?
Yeah. I mean, there's a good chance I'd be dead. That's probably the only way to look at it. There's a few people that I've come across at national meetings and things like that are my age that, their doctors did a similar decision. I don't even want to think about it because, there's so many people that I'm aware of that aren't here anymore that weren't that lucky. Mm-hmm. And many of them much younger than myself. That's the scary part, Yeah. And I think that's part of the reason the hemophilia world isn't ready for people my age. That's been a whole different experience. Just because you have hemophilia, which is bad enough, you don't escape all the other rigors that go along with aging. Yeah. You get arthritis, you get all kinds of things. Your eyes change, your hearing changes. There's just so many things that come along with aging, and so many of those things are complicated for treatment. Take pain management, for instance, because you have hemophilia and because your liver is affected by so many medications, it becomes a juggling act, and you become the teacher to your physician because they don't know a lot about it. And so you've got to figure it out. You got to work with the treatment center, try to figure things out and make life tolerable, where it's different for people who don't have those issues. I dodged the HIV bullet, but one of the effects of going back on cryo was hepatitis C. And I had hepatitis C. It damaged my liver because at first they didn't know anything about it. And so you went along for years being told that it's non-A, non-B hepatitis. We don't know what it is, but we don't think you need to be too concerned about it. And, but pretty soon, if you have it long enough, it starts to give you cirrhosis. And, you tell a doctor you've got cirrhosis and they think, oh, well, the guy was an alcoholic. No, I wasn't an alcoholic. I had hemophilia and I got hepatitis C. I want to back up for a second, if that's okay, because I was just reminded of something that made life in the 80s and 90s really scary, and that was the HIV. And if you told people that you had hemophilia, they were afraid. It was like they didn't want to be around you. Like all of a sudden you were one of these people that might have HIV. Even some of the people that had hemophilia were, mistakenly assumed that they were gay, and it was a horrible situation. People were of course, the knowledge base was just very limited, but people just made assumptions, and it was scary. It was scary to have hemophilia. It was, scary to be around people because they had this aversion. Yeah. That was a whole other side to that era.
Can't imagine that, managing the medication, the treatment, all that's going along with that, and then the psychosocial issues of society during it pressing down on you.
But, back to what I was talking about with medications and that sort of thing, for me, I've got some arthritis in various places, my lower back and pelvis and my ankle. Treating the pain for that, I can't take much Tylenol because it affects the liver. Mm-hmm. And I do, my liver is pretty severely compromised. My functions are normal, but I have to really baby it. Let's put it that way. I can't take any alcohol, and frankly, that's something I wish I could. Growing up in California and having friends in the wine country and that sort of thing, life was good then. Before the hepatitis C, but.
Things continue to change all the time. It's crazy.
Oh, don't they though? Yeah.
Walter, you've lived through so much, like the change, the challenges, victories, not so many victories. When you think about your journey, what's your biggest takeaway from it all?
Well, I don't know. I think maybe it's what happened here in Idaho. I had my first contact with a support system. I became affiliated with the local chapter. At that point, they were just a standalone. It was called the Idaho Hemophilia Foundation. It had gotten started by a family whose son died of HIV/AIDS. That was their way of coping, I guess, to start this foundation. Mm-hmm. And then later it became affiliated with the National Hemophilia Foundation, now National Bleeding Disorders Foundation. But that was the first time I had contact with a support group, and it really changed my outlook. It made me realize that I wasn't alone. It made me aware of what was going on in the community, developments, support, all of those kinds of things. And I became really quite active. I was with the chapter for about 30 years. And I served as president for several years and was on the board for many, many years. Went to Washington Days many times. I think I went to Washington Days 9 or 10 times. In a way, I hated to have hemophilia identify me, but then I kind of got over that and decided that it didn't identify me. It was just part of my life. And it gave me a real sense of wanting to give back to the hemophilia community. And I think that's one thing that I feel best about in my journey here in Idaho, with being in touch with, people at the chapter level and people at the national level. Even I went to World twice, I think, and once in Vancouver and once in Seville, Spain. That was a real experience. So get to meet people from all over the world. I've had video chats like this with people from Africa. Mm-hmm. It's amazing what people have to put up in the third world countries. It breaks your heart.
Truly, yeah. Walter, I'm curious, what do you hope people take away from your story and from your journey?
Well, that's a hard question for me to answer. I guess I would hope that younger people understand how important it is to stay involved, to get to know your community. That's one thing that I have seen with a lot of young teens, preteens, teens. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to have hemophilia be part of their lives. And so they won't come to chapter events, or they won't go to doctor appointments, all kinds of things, they want to play football, But I would hope that they would hear somebody like myself to know that, it's possible to lead a relatively normal life. There's things you can't do, shouldn't do, but life still has an awful lot to offer. And I've done so many things that people in much better health than me have not done. I've hiked rim to rim on the Grand Canyon. I've spent a week down there. I've been all over the Sierras. I've been all over the Sawtooth Mountains here in Idaho. Traveled to Europe. I've been to Spain. I've been to Italy. Walked hundreds of miles, and some of it painfully, but do it, stay active, do the things that you can and enjoy them, and don't let hemophilia define you. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
It does. Walter, that was beautiful. And we can't thank you enough for sharing your inspiring journey with us and helping give hope to the next generation, because it's so important to understand that we are all in this together, no matter where we're at in the timeline of life. It's important to live a sustainable, healthy, and fulfilling life. And you are the embodiment of that, Walter. So thank you for sharing your time with us.
You're very welcome. I hope there are ears out there to hear it.
Well, thank you again, Prisilla, Walter, Jeffrey, and Barb, for joining today's program. Thanks, as always, to our presenting sponsor, Takeda, bleedingdisorders.com, for more from them. And thank you to segment sponsor, Genentech. Remember, visit hemashort.com to watch the short film. We could not produce the Bloodstream podcast without your support, so thank you. We are grateful for it. Bordeaux, next episode comes out in a week, June 20th. Haha. Mm-hmm. What can listeners expect to hear on the 20th?
Oh my gosh. It's a Stop the Bleeding extravaganza episode.
It is.
How many years is this Stop the Bleeding situation?
Started being published in 2013. Started being filmed in 2012. Started being talked about in 2011.
That is crazy. This is a very special episode. We're launching a campaign, kind of a nostalgia remember.
A retrospective.
A retrospective, if you will, that will be on socials and things. And so we're kicking it off with a conversation that you get to have with
my buddy.
First ever directors of Stop the Bleeding with all y'all, Mr. Jim Fagan, who's just legendary.
He is, and he's also one of my dearest friends. So it's a fun conversation. Look forward to that. That's coming out next week. And with that, that is all for this episode. Again, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to the Bloodstream Podcast wherever you listen to have the next episode delivered to you the moment it goes live.
And as always, email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com so you can inquire about casting opportunities if you would like to share your story. And please find us on social media. Give us a follow or reach out on DM. We are all on the social media, Bloodstream Media or Patrick and myself.
Yeah, we know how all that works. I'm your host, Patrick James Lynch.
And I am your other host, along with Mr. Scoots.
And until next time, take self-care of yourself. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.